All right, hi guys, it's Mrs. Allgood again. Today's a pretty big day of notes, so just be aware of that from the get-go. It's going to take me a little while to record this so that you can watch it later. Today we're talking more about roots, and then we're also talking about modified stems and modified leaves. So like I said, pretty big day of notes. So just pay attention, and I think you'll learn a lot, and I think you'll learn a lot today that will really help you out with your plant portfolio. So let's talk about growth in roots first. First, I want you to understand the difference between indeterminate and determinate growth. If we're talking about something that does indeterminate growth, it basically means that they continue to grow as long as they live. Okay, because that's advantageous for something like a plant because it's going to increase their exposure to sunlight, air, and soil. So it's in their best interest to keep growing as long as they're alive because it will help them to survive better. Okay, we do not do indeterminate growth. We do determinate growth, which means we stop growing after we reach a certain size. Okay, we do not grow for the entirety of our lifetime. All right, let's keep moving. All right. This is something that I think will be helpful for you, especially this time of year, and especially when we're home and you might be looking to spruce up your house or an apartment a little bit. And so it might be important for you to understand the difference between annuals, biennials, and perennials. So if something is an annual, it means it completes its life cycle in a single season or a single year, okay? It's an annual. So if you or your family members have ventured out to Lowe's or Home Depot, most of the plants that they have out that have flowers on them already that are really pretty and you're like, oh, this would look great here, I need to plant this, those are usually annuals. That's kind of how they make money. If you buy an annual, it's only going to last for that season or that year. And usually we say a season. I don't know of any flowers that bloom for an entire year. But that's kind of how they get you. That's how they make money. Because once the season's over and that plant is dead, well, then you got to go buy a new plant and plant something else. So a lot of what you will plant, if you have a house and a yard or whatever, a lot of what you'll plant there is going to not be an annual. It's going to be a perennial. It's going to be something that comes back year after year after year. So some examples of annual crops would be most crops, wheat, corn, rice. You plant those seeds every year. Okay, biennials complete their life cycle in 2 years. Flowering usually occurs during the second year. Beets and carrots are biennials. And I know people say, oh, but beets and carrots are storage roots and carrots can be tap roots. There are things that fall underneath multiple categories, and that's okay. The reason you probably didn't know carrots were a biennial is because flowering usually occurs during the second year, and they're typically harvested in the first year, so you miss seeing their flowers. Now, if you have a house with a yard, a lot of what you might see is going to be a perennial, okay? Or if you have landscaping or you see things on the way to school when you used to go to school. Perennials come back year after year. So right now, what I see a lot of in my neighborhood, I'm seeing a lot of azaleas. Okay, if you're familiar with the Masters golf tournament, the azaleas are usually out by the time that tournament starts. They come back year after year. Some of your trees and bushes that are blooming right now, those are perennials. It's not something you have to plant every year. So you might see your forsythia, which is the yellow, kind of a bush-looking plant. You'll see your azaleas. Cherry blossoms are starting to bloom right now. Okay, those are all perennials. All right, let's see. Let's talk about a meristem. Okay, a meristem is a region of unspecialized cells that is undergoing a lot of cell division. Okay, so when we looked at the onion root tip back when we did mitosis and you had to look underneath on the microscope slide for cells that were all in all different phases of mitosis, you were looking at one of the meristems of that plant. And meristems are present throughout a plant's life. You know, its roots need to grow and grow deeper into the soil so it can access more water. All right. There's going to be two types of meristems that we talk about this week. All right. The first one is an apical meristem. So as I wrote up here, if you can remember that apex means tip, okay, we're talking about top of the shoot, so top of the part of the plant that's growing upward, okay, out of the soil, and then the tip of the root that's growing deeper down in the soil. And so that's what this says. These are the two places that apical meristems will be located. The tips of roots, and then the terminal or apical buds and the axillary buds of shoots. So basically, you want to think about apical meristems allowing for growth in one plane, but two different directions, growing upward and growing downward. That's where our apical meristems are going to be located. So apical meristems, like I said, are regions where there's a lot of cell division going on, and it's going to allow the plant to grow in length. Okay, so the plant is going to be able to get longer, taller, and then grow deeper into the soil. The other type of meristem that we'll talk about later on in the week is called a lateral meristem, which is going to allow the plant, especially like a tree trunk, to grow in width. But for right now, we're just focusing on the apical meristems. Okay, so this is a picture of the onion root tip that we looked at under the microscope several months ago. And if you remember, we focused in on basically this area right here because this was the area that had cells that were actively dividing. How they make these slides is they take a thin section through an onion root tip and they add a chemical to stop those cells from dividing at whatever stage they were in. So that's why you will find about 90% of your cells here being in interphase and then, less being in some of the other phases. Okay, difference between primary growth. Primary growth is growing this root deeper down into the soil or growing the shoot tip upward. Secondary growth is growing in width, and while both roots and stems are capable of growing in width, we're really only going to focus on the stems growing in width. All right, so some structures associated with primary growth in roots. First is the root cap or root tip. And so think of it like a thimble that somebody might use to sew with. It covers the tip of your finger when you're using a needle. It's a thimble-like cone of cells, so right here, okay, that protects the delicate, actively dividing cells of the apical meristem. So think of it kind of like a cap on your pen. Okay, this might be where the ink comes out of your pen, and this is your cap on your pen that protects that so that it doesn't dry out. Here, we're not trying to prevent the cells of the meristem from drying out. We are just trying to protect those cells because those are the actively dividing cells that will allow our root to grow deeper down into the soil. Okay, let's see what else. Two roles of the apical meristem and roots. Growth is still in two directions, so it's going to replace cells of the root cap that are scraped away by the soil. So it's kind of like the cells, if you think about on our skin, maybe on your arm, okay? If you brush some of those cells off, there are cells ready to replace that right away. So these cells of the root cap, as they push through the soil, some of these cells may come off, but then these actively dividing cells of the apical meristem are there to divide and replace those cells, okay? So these cells can slough off just like our top layers of our skin can, but then you have cells behind it that are ready to replace them, okay? And then you also have, it produces cells for primary growth. So we have two arrows here. The downward pointing arrow is that we're using this meristem to replace the cells that we lost here that may be sloughed off. The cells that get pushed upward are what is really elongating this root here, okay? So that's why we have growth in two directions, because the top one is allowing for growth, the bottom one is allowing for replacement of cells that have come off. Okay, so we have three zones of the root. All right, we've got the zone of cell division. Think about the area on that onion root tip that we focused on. Okay, that was the zone of cell division. That's where we had all those actively dividing cells that we would look at to find the cells in the various phases. So your zone of cell division is going to be your closest zone to your apical meristem and your root cap. Then you have your zone of elongation. So if you remember looking at your onion root tip, as we went further up, the cells got a little bit longer, okay? So what it says here is that cell division alone is not enough for growth. Yes, we've got to divide them, but then they've got to elongate. And then what they'll do after they'll elongate is they will differentiate, which means they basically decide what type of plant cell they're going to be. They take on a specific role. And so then the top part, the part that's furthest away from the root tip, is going to be your zone of differentiation, which is also called your zone of maturation. And so this is the region where the cells differentiate. They take on a specific role or cell type. So think about all the different types of plant cells that we talked about last week. Your tracheids, your vessel elements, your sieve tube members, your parenchyma cells, your epidermal cells, all those specific cell types. And I think that's your next quiz I've got to make, is about plant cells and tissues. So you've got a review sheet that you should have done for that. And so I'll get that quiz made later on this afternoon. All right. So we mainly talked about roots on Friday. So now we're going to move on and talk about stems. And so just like we did modified roots on Friday, we're going to talk about modified stems today. Okay. So stems are an organ that raises or separates the leaves and exposes them to sunlight. They also raise reproductive structures, which should make it easier to distribute or disperse pollen and fruit. So they're kind of raising all those reproductive parts of the flower upward. All right, some terminology here. Stems consist of alternating nodes and internodes. So the nodes are the point at which the leaf, which is this entire structure, the point at which those attach. And the internode is the section of the stem that is between the nodes, because again, that's what inter means. It means between. And if I ever go too fast, just feel free to pause me. I just know I've got a lot to get through today, so I'm trying to speed it up a little bit. All right, this is important. This is one of the terms on your plant portfolio list. Okay, this is an axillary bud. All right. So when you look at a plant, and you look at the main stem, the axillary bud will be here. Okay, it's going to be at the junction between where a leaf comes off and where the main stem is. So this is what an axillary bud might look like. Now, those of you who've taken anatomy, you've heard that term axillary before. Okay, axillary is the regional term for armpit, just like you have your Axe deodorant spray. There's a reason it was called that, because we first used it for deodorant, which is used on the armpit. Axillary is like armpit. So these little buds are kind of in the upper armpit of where a stem meets a leaf. Now, I know what you'll say, and you'll say, well, look, Miss Allgood, there's a leaf there, there's a leaf there, there's a leaf there, there's a leaf there. Why is there not an axillary bud there? Because these are leaflets, okay? That gets into simple versus compound leaves, which I think we get into today. But for right now, let's just talk about axillary buds. Okay, so the term axillary on the human body refers to the armpit region. We just went over that. On a plant, the axillary bud is going to be located in the upper angle, formed by a leaf and a stem. Axillary buds help with lateral growth. Now it says with there, that's not necessarily true. Axillary buds are going to help the plant to grow fuller, because if there's a bud here, that means another leaf can come off of there. And a leaf may have many leaflets like you see here. Look in this picture, axillary bud, axillary bud, axillary bud, axillary bud. You're not going to find an axillary bud here because these are not leaves, these are leaflets. So this is a compound leaf. Axillary buds are usually dormant, which means they're not usually active. We've got to do something to the plant to get them to be active. So that's what we're going to go into. Okay, at the top of the plant is an apical bud. Okay, it looks something like that. That's at the very tippy top. Remember that apex means tip or point. So apical bud is at the top. You'll see this in some of the bushes that you might find growing around your yard or your neighborhood. So the apical bud is the bud located at the top or apex of the plant, and it's what helps the plant to grow in height. And we'll talk about the hormone that's being produced that helps with that. All right, so this is something called apical dominance, which I think is kind of neat. The apical bud produces a hormone called auxin, which we will talk about either later this week or early next week. Okay? Auxin does a lot of things in the plant. One thing it does is it promotes the growth of a stem. Okay? So that's why the apical bud is at the very top of the plant, and it is trying to get the plant to grow taller. And that's what auxin does. Now, when auxin is being produced, that suppresses the growth of axillary buds, because it's kind of like saying you can only grow in one direction at a time. Are you going to grow taller or are you going to grow fuller? So if the apical bud is still there, the axillary buds will not be active. Now, if you cut off the apical bud, this is going to stimulate the axillary buds to grow. So when you cut off the apical bud, now auxin is no longer being produced in that location, and auxin is what's suppressing the growth of the axillary buds. So once you cut off the apical bud and you get rid of that supply of auxin, now the axillary buds can grow, and that's going to make the plant fuller or bushier. So typically this is called pruning or pinching back. So if we wanted this plant's kind of tall and spindly, if we wanted it to become more full, we would cut that apical bud off, and in the time it takes for that apical bud to grow back, the axillary buds would be active and producing more leaves, which will make the plant look fuller. Okay, So even though I know this is an artificial tree, you know, people who grow Christmas trees, if you are used to getting a live Christmas tree every year, you know, most people don't want the tall, skinny ones. If they find them out in nature, they want the nice, big, fat ones. So they've got to understand apical dominance. So every so often, they're going to want to cut off the apical bud at the top, which will allow this tree to go fuller and thicker, okay, which is kind of what we want. All right, guys, so what we're going to take a look at now are evolutionary adaptations or modified stems. So on your plant portfolio list, when it says, here's a structure, tell me what type of modification it is usually asking you whether it is a modified root, modified stem, or modified leaf, possibly a modified epidermal cell. We'll get into that later. So these are 5 modified stems. First, we have rhizomes. Okay, so a rhizome could be like ginger, and you can find ginger in the grocery store. If you're up for a little bit more of a challenge, I would not suggest going and digging up an iris that your mom maybe has planted that is her prized iris in the yard. I do not want a picture. If you do an iris, I don't want a picture of the iris flower. I want a picture of the rhizome structure. Okay, so ginger itself is a rhizome. It's a horizontal stem that grows underground. So an iris, for example, is a monocot. So if we were to see the leaves, it would be parallel venation. This is the rhizome, a horizontal stem that grows underground. These are the fibrous roots that it would have. Okay, so ginger is a rhizome, an iris is a rhizome, but I would make sure that if you're using an iris that I can actually see the rhizome part. I don't just want the flower for that entry. Okay, bulbs. Bulbs are vertical underground stems consisting of enlarged storage leaves. There will still be leaves growing above the ground. Okay, these are sort of storage leaves underground. An onion is a good example of a bulb. Garlic is a good example of a bulb. And if you've ever seen this little hair type things hanging down here, you see those hair type things. Those are your fibrous roots. Because if you look at the leaf structure here, you see parallel venation. So that should be a monocot. It should have fibrous roots. Next are stolons. Okay, stolons are kind of neat. We are probably a little far from getting into strawberry season, but maybe people are planting those now. Stolons are horizontal shoots or stems that grow along the surface of the ground. So the rhizome that we talked about before, that grows underground. That's an underground horizontal stem. Okay, this is an above ground horizontal stem. So basically, this is very common with strawberry plants. They send out a little runner, and then they drop roots. And then they send out another runner, and then they drop roots. I want to say that maybe Bermuda grass is also a stolon. You'd have to double check that. But I think I checked that for a student last year, and I believe Bermuda grass uses stolons as well. So how this works, they send out runners that drop their own roots to become a whole new strawberry plant. And of course, this is asexual reproduction because we're not combining the genetics from more than one parent. So we had rhizomes, ginger and iris, bulbs like an onion or garlic, stolons, which is like a strawberry, tubers, which are potatoes. So tubers are also stems, okay? When you see a potato, you are looking at a stem. It's an enlarged end of a rhizome or stolon, again, but don't use a potato for those terms. A potato is a tuber. It stores away starch, and the eye of the potato can be cut off and used to grow a new potato plant. So if you forgot about that bag of potatoes sitting in your pantry and you go back and it has eyes on it, you could cut a little chunk of the potato that has that eye. You could put it in the ground and eventually you would get a new potato plant. Oh, let's see. Our last stem modification is a thorn. I would pay pretty close attention to this because even I can get a little confused here. A thorn is a modified stem that is located where a leaf emerges from the stem. Okay? So notice the difference here. A thorn is a sharp-pointed modified stem. A spine, like a spine that you'd see on a cactus, or some plants also have spines, is a sharp-pointed structure that is a modified leaf. So you say, how am I going to know the difference? A spine should be coming out of the stem right below where an axillary bud is. Okay? Because remember, axillary bud is in that upward angle between a leaf and a stem. So if it's a spine, it should be coming out of the stem and there should be an axillary bud associated with it. A prickle. A prickle is a modification of an epidermal cell. It's usually kind of almost shaped like a shark's tooth, I guess you might say. It's usually got kind of this angle to it. So if you think about what a rose has, a rose, that's what our question is here, our rose does not have thorns, despite the song. Our rose has prickles. Okay, so don't turn in your plant portfolio and show me the stem of a rose and call that a thorn just because that's what you've always called it. It is not a thorn. A rose has prickles. So this was from my generation. This is Poison. Their most famous song was Every Rose Has Its Thorn, but we now know that roses don't have thorns. They have prickles instead, although Every Rose Has Its Prickle really doesn't have the same ring to it. But that's from my era. Ask your parents about Poison. All right, let's move on to modified leaves. Okay. General information about leaves first, and then we'll get into some classifications and some modifications. Leaves are the main photosynthetic organ of a plant. Although, if you have stems that are green, if they're green, they've got chloroplasts in them, they can also carry out photosynthesis. All right, big thing of the day. So not only am I blowing your mind with the difference between what a thorn is and what a prickle is, but now you get to learn what a true leaf is. A leaf consists of a blade, which is this, attached to a petiole. Okay, this is not pedicle. We learned the term pedicle back when we did flower structure and fruit structure. It's not pedicle, that's the stem. This is a petiole. It's kind of like the stem of the leaf. But what you're going to see is the leaf is not just this structure. The leaf is this plus that. That entire thing is the leaf. And then just remember that monocots have parallel venation in their leaves and dicots have branched venation. Okay, simple versus compound leaves. Simple is a single undivided blade. Okay, this is a simple leaf. Now, if I were to circle the leaf in this picture, okay, that is circling the leaf. If you just circle this part, you are just circling the blade, not the leaf. Okay? If it is a simple leaf, it will have an axillary bud at its base, which is this little thing that you see there. If it's a compound leaf, okay, if I'm going to circle the leaf in this picture, I'm going to circle this entire thing. That is a leaf. How do I know that that entire thing is a leaf? Well, because this is the axillary bud right down there. Notice there's no axillary buds in here. That means this entire thing is a compound leaf. So you see some other examples of simple and compound leaves. So a clover is a palmately compound leaf. It means it kind of fans out like when you fan out your fingers on your hand. Okay, so looking at this, one thing I want you to be able to do is to always circle the leaf. So I see that this is my axillary bud here, which means I'm going to circle that entire structure. That's my leaf. What am I going to circle here? I'm going to circle that. Sorry, I forgot the parts down there. And I'm going to circle this. What am I going to circle here? Well, here's your axillary bud, so I'm going to circle this entire thing. Okay, evolutionary benefits of simple versus compound leaves. The reason that some plants will want to have compound leaves is it can enable them to withstand strong winds and prevent tearing. And then if they were to be infected by a fungus or some other kind of pathogen, maybe even a virus that infects plants, by having separate little leaflets, it may help to confine that pathogen to a single leaflet. All right. What we're going to wrap up with is 5 modifications of leaves, and then we will be all set for today. So tendrils, we'll come back and talk about tendrils when we get to tropisms in a few days. Tendrils are modified leaves or stems that wrap around something for support. So you see this with some vegetables that you might grow in the garden, okay? The act of them wrapping around will be called thigmotropism, when they wrap around a stake or a support. Okay, spines. We talked about spines with thorns and prickles a few minutes ago. Spines are modified leaves. They are mainly for defense. So you think, okay, well, if I'm looking at a cactus and this is its spine, then what is the big green part? Well, the big green part is the stem, and that's what carries out photosynthesis in the cactus, is the fleshy green stems. Again, if I go too fast, just pause it. Storage leaves, you want to think about something like aloe, okay? Adapted for storing water. Aloe is a succulent plant. If you hear that term succulent plant, you want to think about it being able to store water. These are kind of weird. You're not going to find these around here, I wouldn't think. These are reproductive leaves. So they produce these little plantlets. I know they kind of look like Venus flytraps, but they're not. They are part of a succulent. But see all these little leaflets that are coming off the side? This is called kalanchoe. And those little leaflets fall off and become their own plants. So those are called reproductive leaves. And our last one today is a bract, okay? Bracts you might be able to find. The most obvious example of a bract is going to be in a poinsettia. So these red things that we would think are petals or leaves, they are not. They are bracts. They are modified leaves that surround a group of flowers. So I know what you say. You say, isn't this entire thing a flower? No. The little yellow things in the middle are the flowers. The red things are the modified leaves that surround the flowers in here. So then this is a bract. These are bracts. I am not the world's foremost bract expert. So if you think you see an example of a bract, I would double check that by Googling it or figuring out what species of plant or flower that is and then checking to see if that has bracts. If you send me a picture, I'll be glad to try to figure it out as best I can. But, there's only so much I know about bracts. You don't have this page. This I just thought it'd be interesting to show you some of the things you eat and what part of the plants they are. Okay, so leaves, modified leaves, or not modified leaves, but leaves that you eat would be cabbage, lettuce, spinach, things like that. Stems are celery and cauliflower, believe it or not. Fruits, we know tomatoes are fruit, eggplants, peppers are fruit. Pods, I think, speak for themselves. Flowers are sprouting broccoli. Some roots that you eat would be like radishes, turnips, carrots, beetroot, yams, rutabaga, parsnips. Bulbs that you eat, onion, garlic. Leek is also a bulb, which means it's a modified stem. Tubers, potato, sweet potato, those are tubers, which are also modified stems. Seeds that you eat would be peas and like your corn kernels. All right, that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you tune in later and look for your quiz that'll be posted later on this afternoon. Thanks. Miss you guys.